Racism and White Supremacy, Rights and Protests, Chapter 1.
Before the Civil Rights Movement, what was the background of the Civil Rights Movement? What are civil rights? They are the rights of an individual to legal, political, and social equality. In the U.S., they're guaranteed under the Constitution. Some of them include voting rights, right to a fair trial, fair and equal treatment under the law, and free speech, religion, and movement. The Civil Rights Movement in the U.S. aimed to secure these rights for all U.S. citizens. Government support was needed, though, and laws needed to change. The American government system is a federal democratic system. The Supreme Court became important in the role of racial cases. African Americans demanded change in federal laws and appealed to the court to alter the laws in their favor during the Civil Rights Movement. So what came before the Civil Rights Movement? In 1776, the Declaration of Independence was written. It stated that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Native Americans and black slaves, however, were not granted these rights and freedoms. Slave background. Many African Americans are descended from enslaved people whom were trafficked to the U.S. Slaves often worked in terrible, hot conditions in southern fields. Many of those fields grew cotton. Some bought their freedom and some escaped to the north.
Discrimination, segregation, and violence against African Americans. So to begin, we have some background information. The Civil War was a disagreement between northern free states and southern slave states. The Civil War ended with Lincoln making the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which promised to end slavery in Confederate states, and in 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, which abolished slavery. So after this, the South entered Reconstruction. Freed men had no property, education, or money, and very few were given land, so most ended up working as sharecroppers, who were people that shared crops with a landowner in exchange for a place to live, but many were trapped in debt and stayed in poverty. As you can see in the picture, the sharecroppers depicted look very similar to slaves. So in 1865, after the 13th Amendment was passed, white supremacists wanted blacks to remain subservient. Some southern states even created laws that allowed violence against black people if they prevented them from being witnesses in court and limited where they were able to live. And so they formed the Ku Klux Klan, which was known as the KKK, an organization which used intimidation, terror, and violence against black people who wanted to do better for themselves, and their main goal was to maintain white supremacy. In 1866, Republicans had the majority in Congress, and they didn't like the way that new state laws were oppressing black Americans. So the 14th Amendment created equal protection of the law for all citizens. However, there was violent backlash in southern states, which resulted in military rule in the South, and support also increased for the KKK. But in 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed, which granted black male suffrage. In the 1870s, black men started to gain some political power, and some were even elected into office, even though it was a small number. A small, educated black middle class was also formed, and black colleges were created. Reconstruction ended in 1877. Troops were removed, and southern states passed Jim Crow laws. These laws imposed segregation and wanted to keep black people in their quote-unquote place. Public institutions were often segregated, including restaurants, transportation, and schools. These laws were justified due to the 14th Amendment, which said that separate but equal facilities were okay. However, it really wasn't equal, and white facilities were usually much better than black facilities. In 1898, a black newspaper suggested in South Carolina that women sometimes consented to sex with black men, and their office was burnt down, and 1,400 black people were forced to leave the city. Lynching was a very popular occurrence in the South, and it was often used against black men accused of raping white women. Whites were never arrested or punished for the violence against black people. Although the 15th Amendment granted black male suffrage, poll taxes often prevented black people from voting, and to vote they had to pay to register, and people could not afford it. Literacy and citizen tests were also used to limit black people from voting, and since there were some white people who were illiterate, a clause was put into place which said that if you were a free man before 1865, you can vote without the tests. Black people were completely disenfranchised by 1900, and only 3% of Southern black people could vote. Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 was the first case which challenged Southern race laws. In 1892, Homer Plessy sat in a whites-only part of a train in Louisiana. He appeared white but had a black grandparent, so he was considered black. He was arrested for refusing to leave a white train. The trial attempted to overturn the 14th Amendment. However, the court ruled that it was not unconstitutional if the separate facilities were equal. So this was the case that established separate but equal, and in the following years, the conservative Democrats dominated the South, making it difficult for black people to achieve any type of equality.
So now on to section 3 of this chapter. The question that we will be answering is, how important was the NAACP in the development of the civil rights movement? So, the NAACP was founded in 1909. One of its founder members was Webb Du Bois. The organization welcomed both white and black members. Its goal was to publicize the injustices. They had a magazine called The Crisis, which Du Bois edited himself, and their main focus was gaining equality through litigation. So, for that reason, the NAACP hired lawyers, and they were often very successful. In the early 1900s, the NAACP contributed to 2 important cases. In 1915, the Supreme Court knocked out the Oklahoma's grandfather clause, and later on, it also ruled a Kentucky law on segregated residential zoning unconstitutional. So how did the 2 world wars affect the civil rights movement? Great migration took place during World War I, where over 350,000 blacks moved to the north seeking better jobs. Many blacks also joined the armed forces in 1917 when the US entered World War I. However, they were poorly treated and segregated, and they returned determined to fight white supremacy. Now, during World War II, nearly 1 million blacks were called to fight, whereas others left to work in the north. World War II saw the development of the Double V campaign, which was about fighting racism at home and abroad. Moreover, the first black general, Benjamin O. Davis, was appointed by President Roosevelt. Returning black soldiers were offered financial aid to attend college. However, inequality was not achieved. Army leaders had low opinions of black soldiers, and they were also maltreated by being refused service and in the public transport system. Now, in the meantime, discrimination still existed in the North, although it was not as extreme as in the South. Blacks were often excluded from white neighborhoods as a result of competition for urban housing. The jobs they were given were for the most part low-paying, and many turned to gangs and crime. However, the North also helped catalyze the growth of black culture and jazz. Black activism was slowly growing, and the foundations of the civil rights movement were being laid. In the 1930s in Chicago, a campaign against discrimination led to blacks being employed in retail stores. President Roosevelt also set up the Fair Employment Practice Committee in order to ensure that blacks were employed in the war industries. However, there were still hate strikes in the North by white workers refusing to work with blacks. So the big question is, what was achieved by the NAACP in the 1930s and 40s? During World War II, its impact was rapidly growing, and membership went from 50,000 to 450,000. Grassroots activity was developing, and more people began attending NAACP classes, which helped encourage voting. The organization was also influential in the outlawing of the all-white Democratic primary election in Texas by the Supreme Court. In terms of the education system, the NAACP focused on gaining equality within the segregated system. There was a huge Supreme Court victory when it ruled that Virginia and Maryland had to equally pay black and white teachers. However, discrimination still prevailed, especially in the South, where the courts were all white. The presidential support for civil rights was also on the rise. After the Great Depression, FDR's New Deal helped many blacks get back to work. The president also advocated for fair play and equal opportunity, while the South was losing influence due to the growth of the Democratic Party. Now, when it comes to President Truman, in 1946 he appointed the Committee on Civil Rights to investigate cases of violence against returning World War II veterans. In 1947, the committee published the To Secure These Rights report. which advocated for more equality. The president also proposed a bill to ban segregation, poll taxes, and lynching. However, it was killed off in the courts, and in July 1948, he desegregated the armed forces. And now on to the last section of Chapter 1 about Brown versus Board of Education of 1954. The question is, what was the impact of the Supreme Court decision of 1954? In 1952, the NAACP brought 5 cases to the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice Earl Warren delivered the unanimous decision in May 1954. He said that segregation was dehumanizing, and even if the schools were equal in material terms, there were still negative psychological effects. The court called for the desegregation of schools to comply with the 14th Amendment. However, there was widespread resistance in the South to the desegregation of schools. In Virginia, which borders D.C., by 1965 only 12,000 of the 235,000 black students went to desegregated schools. There was virtually no desegregation in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, or South Carolina. Nearly all Southern states went on to sign the Southern Manifesto in March 1956 to condemn the Brown decision and unite the South in resistance.
Little Rock, Arkansas. 9 black students enrolled at Central High were met with a violent mob when they tried to enter the school. Instead of protecting the students, National Guard troops that had been sent blocked the students from entering the school. President Eisenhower sent in 1,200 paratroopers to escort the students. Outcomes of the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Segregation remained in schools in the Deep South for several more years. Eisenhower then passed 2 Civil Rights Acts in the late 1950s to try to gain more support before the upcoming election. The first, in 1957, set up a Civil Rights Commission to monitor racial relations, and the second, in 1960, gave criminal penalties to officials obstructing black voters. However, both of these Civil Rights Acts got significantly weakened in Congress and did not have the full effect Eisenhower had hoped for.